Thank you, Moises, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. As you may know, I am the great-granddaughter of Mary E. Jones Parrish. As Moises said, the first person to write an eyewitness account about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. My great-grandmother was a journalist and a writer. She was also a teacher, and so she was well-versed in the literary arts. Also, she was someone who was very deeply involved in her community, and as we call it today, she was a survivor, along with a little 7-year-old girl, Florence Mary Parrish, who grew up to become my grandmother, Florence Mary Parrish Bruner. Today, I'll speak to you a little bit about our new book, The Nation Must Awake, although my great-grandmother's book was originally titled Events of the Tulsa Disaster. I'll tell you a little bit about how that book came to me, how I was entrusted with it by my father, who wanted me to do something with it. And I'll tell you a little bit about our relationship around the book. Our relationship around the book, around the story itself, and how I took his charge to bring my great-grandmother's legacy forward and to fulfill a promise that I made to him. During the 1993-94 holiday season, I was visiting my family in California. My dad, Bill Bruner Jr., was still living in San Francisco, where I was born. At the time, I had been living in Washington, D.C. with my own little family for about 10 years and traveled home each year to see my folks. On that visit, he took me into his room where we could talk privately. My dad was a gregarious guy with an outsized laugh who had a presence that filled the room. This time, though, he was quiet and serious. He pulled a small, red, cloth-bound book from among his papers and handed it to me. He said that his grandmother on his mother's side wrote it and that he wanted to see if I could do anything with it. It was titled Events of the Tulsa Disaster by Mary Elizabeth Jones Parrish, my great-grandmother. That charge was the beginning of the journey that brings me here today. When I got back to DC and started on the book, I could not believe what I was reading. Naturally, I had long been aware of the atrocities that racist ideologues in our country committed against its Black citizens earlier in our country's history. But the well-organized and ruthlessly executed violence they unleashed in Greenwood over that 48-hour period had an intensity and character that was even more sinister than what I had ever read about before. It was clear to me that this was warfare on American soil that reached a fever pitch of brutality coupled with an unprecedented level of ruthless efficiency. The savagery of the attack stunned me as I learned how calculated every move was, from parading machine guns through the neighborhood to be mounted on Standpipe Hill, to surrounding the district from all sides to make escape more difficult for fleeing residents, to dispatching airplanes to intimidate, pursue, and slaughter victims from the air, to encouraging boys as young as 10 to participate in the looting and killing spree, thereby normalizing killing people in the minds of young children, barely older than my own 7-year-old grandmother, Florence Mary, who watched the violence unfold from their apartment window. That was one of the most shocking aspects of this whole ordeal for me. I began to contemplate what to do with this newfound information of the story of my own foremother and how she saved herself and her daughter and chronicled this American tragedy for posterity. A new purpose began to compel me. I actually changed the work I was doing and started to focus on what I had always ended up doing at work anyway, writing and editing other folks' writing. I started to pursue a writer's life in earnest, taking writing and editing classes, eventually taking a job with a magazine group and getting my first bylines in the mid-90s. I loftily imagined basing a screenplay on my great-grandmother Mary's book, so I took screenwriting classes, even completing a portion of a script. But I was haunted by the concern that even in the hands of an experienced screenwriter, the significance of my great-grandmother's work would probably be lost. I continued to ponder how I could give her story the treatment it truly deserved. But my truest purpose here today is not to talk about myself. I simply wanted to get to the part where I have the book in my possession and I'm figuring out what to do about it. My true focus is on exploring two questions. What is the legacy of Mary Jones Parrish when as a nation we continue to grapple with the political terror and personal trauma of Tulsa and other parallel history, past and present? And what has been the cost to Mary Parrish's legacy and contribution to history of her being a woman? In her book, Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence, From Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, feminist psychiatrist Dr. Judith Lewis Herman tells us, and I quote, "The ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however," she goes on, "refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial just does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. Quite simply put, the restoration of a viable social order after an event like what happened here in Tulsa depends on truth, as does the restoration to wholeness of the individual victim of political terror. To restate, for healing to happen, truth is not optional. And in Tulsa, with the continuing unfolding of facts and testimonies, the truth of what happened has to remain central to the discussion about responsibility and the social and personal restoration that Judith Herman talks about and writes about. It turns out, however, that truth is a bit trickier than it really should be. A crucial event in how my own participation in this new book came about is now at risk of being rewritten. And the truth buried, as Tulsa's truth was for far too long, a mere 5 months after it happened. On January 6th, I was on Twitter, monitoring the unrest at the Capitol. Fearful that months of bombast springing from the relentless and false claim that the November 2020 election had been stolen on behalf of then-President-elect Joe Biden would culminate in real violence. I followed the news intently as the vote certification was happening inside the building while the ticking time bomb of an agitated mob gathered outside. Grandmother Mary's book sprang to mind. And I quote, "Just as this horde of evil men swept down on the colored section of Tulsa, reducing the accumulation of years of toil and sacrifice to piles of brick, ashes, and twisted iron, If something is not done to bring about justice and to punish them, thereby checking that spirit, just so will they, some future day, sweep down on the homes and business places of their own race. At home in DC, we watched King Mob, as Mary Jones Parrish calls it, a label we see Mary Parrish use in her book, sweep into the Capitol, drunk with rage and seeking vengeance for an imagined wrong, ready to do bodily harm to lawmakers and law enforcement, the embodiment of social order. In a painfully ironic display, Metropolitan Police Department Officer Michael Fanone was beaten with what some reporting has said was a Blue Lives Matter flagpole, while insurrectionists yelled out, "Kill him with his own gun." The officer was tasered, suffered a heart attack and concussion, and has since publicly condemned efforts by some very vocal elected officials to negate the seriousness of the attack on the US Capitol. In this overheated context, extremist lawmakers have begun to shift the narrative of the day from one that correctly assigns responsibility for incitement to the former president to one that casts the rebels as innocent tourists who took an orderly stroll through the Capitol's statuary hall. These bad faith actors within the ranks of government have cynically doubled down on this counter-narrative, jockeying for political advantage at the expense of truth. But we must be ever aware that truth is the first casualty in any war on democratic norms. Rewriting history is how totalitarian regimes exercise social control and maintain absolute power. And to be clear, absolute power within those regimes rests in the hands of relatively few who use dangerous propaganda to convince their supporters to side with the regime. The segment of the population who are spoon-fed white supremacist ideology in our own nation will suffer along with everyone else as democracy is suffocated, but what are essentially primitive urges to enjoy unearned dominance, power, and status keep them aligned with those who seek power for the sake of power. Just as Tulsa has made strides forward, our entire country must commit itself to confronting the truth to avoid sliding ever further toward an undemocratic future where justice itself becomes a casualty of a conspiracy of lies. I was personally compelled by the events of 1/6 and the parallels with what happened in Tulsa 100 years ago to write an article for The Lily, an imprint of the Washington Post. In that January article, I laid out my familial relationship to author Mary Parrish, which garnered attention from several quarters. Among those who contacted me was renowned historian Dr. Scott Ellsworth, who told me that Trinity University Press was scheduled to republish my great-grandmother's book this May. I wrote to Tom Payton, Trinity Press director, shared my article with him, and asked about his vision for this most important material. I hoped that the integrity of my foremother's work and historical significance would be honored. Tom graciously invited me to contribute the afterword essay for the new book, The Nation Must Awake, officially published yesterday, and to represent the author, my intrepid great-grandmother. Needless to say, I was thrilled and I said yes. Since I began on this journey of participating in the republishing of my great-grandmother Mary's book, reporters and others have asked why I think a collective amnesia around the massacre persisted for so long, a silencing that is well documented. Here again, I offer the words of Judith Herman. In order to escape accountability for his crimes, the perpetrator does everything in his power to promote forgetting. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of his victim. If he cannot silence the victim absolutely, he tries to make sure that no one listens. From a 1999 New York Times article, we read, in addition to the death toll, the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, at its height, hopes to answer a number of other questions, many of them grounded in local lore. Blacks here have long maintained that whites used airplanes to bomb buildings in North Tulsa. The commission hopes to find records showing whether any Tulsa residents owned airplanes in 1921 and where they were based. The newspaper of record, by its framing and word choice, goes on record casting doubt on the reliability of Black witness to the destruction. The offense against the community is deepened by widespread unbelief, and the silencing is furthered as the emotional toll of speaking out increases. More broadly, this is not an isolated phenomenon. This so-called amnesia we have seen around the Tulsa offensive mirrors precisely the painfully common deployment of shame in dealing with victims of abuse. One of the most obvious ways to understand this is how it plays out in domestic violence situations, where victims are silenced by fear of recurrence of what has already happened or some other kind of retribution. Unsurprisingly, the perpetrator may in fact feel invigorated by his power to carry out abuse without accountability, reveling in his impunity and feeling no clear sense of internal shame or regret. Simply because he can, the perpetrator loads the least powerful player in the equation with blame, a transaction that preserves the facade of normalcy that is essential to the smooth functioning of a status quo in which the abuser wields the most power. The preservation of power is assured, a situation that is reinforced by the suppression of an honest reckoning that would validate the victim's experience of suffering. The least powerful players, in a game that coerces them into accepting normative rules imposed by the powerful, are left to cope with their complex trauma as best they can, without support or understanding. They may even be saddled with guilt or shame for what someone else did to cause their trauma. In the cruelest irony, the victim is scapegoated for their own suffering. Today, we have a growing understanding of just how corrosive it is to allow abuse to happen and then remain shrouded in darkness. Unfortunately, however, the dark may be the only space that survivors can access. We can easily imagine that, along with the denial of public opportunity to talk about what happened, any emotional space for survivors to talk about the massacre was limited. And although the impetus for survivors to talk about it could have been a powerful drive, it was also one for which there were internal mechanisms of repression at work. This surely produced a conundrum that resounds down through the years. How to talk about this thing that happened, yet remain emotionally safe? The mechanisms of political terror would have done their job, succeeding in consigning victims to a grotesque silence that choked and haunted them as the truth fought to come out. As we know, political terror is intended to invade and inhabit the psyche of its victims. It teaches them that they are not safe, that they must stay in line or else the unthinkable will happen or happen again. that their fate lies in the hands of people who hate them, and that they must endure this condition and its attendant attacks without recourse. I was 20 years old when my Granny Florence Mary died, yet I never heard her or my father speak about the massacre that she survived as a girl. He did not talk about it much, even after he gave me the book when I was 34 years old. And I, naively, took my cue from him, not understanding that he probably needed permission to talk about what he knew from what his mother or grandmother may have told him. No reckoning was on the horizon, and extrapolating, I can well imagine that people grew weary of the burden of remembrance without the possibility of restoration. Yet, too often when secrecy prevails, the story of the traumatic event surfaces not as a verbal narrative, but as a symptom, according to Dr. Herman. I could see some of those symptoms in my own family. Affirmation that remembering and telling the truth are requisite to healing trauma. This applies both individually and societally, although the cost to a society's very sense of itself and the mythologies in which it takes comfort will be great. But these mythologies can be deadly. What happened in Tulsa did not happen in a vacuum or without political context. The world had emerged from World War, and a major pandemic had swept the globe. It was a time of great happenings. Black people were restless for the freedom and self-determination that Reconstruction had promised, and with its educational and political opportunities. Reconstruction was the federal government's attempt to bring a people up from enslavement, and until it was thwarted by regressive ideologues, it had considerable success. We know that scores of African Americans became educated in that time and embraced the promise of full civic participation. Churches and civic organizations helped to organize communities and provided spaces where African Americans built wealth and organized constituencies that empowered them to participate in the broader society. Continuing that tradition and gaining in confidence from African American participation in the war effort, Black folks in Greenwood were the architects of a self-sufficient and proud community and were living the American dream of commensurate reward for hard work and responsible living. But the American nightmare of racialized animus and envy took that from them in a moment of white rage, catalyzed by a discrete, supposedly precipitating event that was far from rare in its expression. But absent that pervasive, destructive sentiment in American society, how much farther along could our country be in the journey toward an enlightenment that values the service an individual could give to the world as much as it does a simplistic, self-serving racial ethos? Instead, one step forward for Black America has consistently been met with backlash, as the incomparable Nina Simone captured and immortalized in her song Backlash Blues. When I try to find a job to earn a little cash, all you got to offer is your mean old white backlash. We can see that the challenge is to foster a collective humanity through truth-telling that makes an event like Tulsa less likely, as opposed to continuing to overload African Americans with the responsibility of assuaging other Americans' anxieties about us. Reflexive anxiety about Black people is woven into so many aspects of American life that even Black people and other people of color must be vigilant about drifting into accepting fear of Black people as a justifiable part of the racial landscape. Anxiety and suspicion also shape perceptions about other groups, and society at large is flooded with negative tropes and stereotypes that become part of a background of assumptions. It is morally incumbent upon all of us to resist these cultivated thought pathways and to reject dehumanizing stereotypes that make violence against identifiable groups more likely. This takes energy and commitment, but it is doable and necessary to prevent a future that Tulsa warns us of. So with the historical and emotional distance provided by our current vantage point, we have the space to delve into what happened with a fresh framework for understanding why people don't talk about the massacre and what we are tasked to do about it. Today, we know the importance of telling your own story and being heard and understood. That's a prime purpose of The Nation Must Awake by Mary E. Jones Parrish. For the first time, the assembled voices of the survivors who appear in her book tell their own stories down through history to the broadest possible audience. Great-grandmother Mary was the reporter and scribe whose work made possible much of the scholarship that has been done about this historical event and the time in which it is set. The organized violence and destruction that disrupted Black Wall Street arose from converging factors, but one of the underlying aims was to erase a self-sufficient and well-organized African American community that stood in direct contrast to any stereotype of Black incompetence and sloth. Here was a town full of industrious Black citizens who did the right things, but still had all they worked so hard for snatched away at the whim of the mob and complicit city fathers. And no one was supposed to talk about it. Today we see things differently, and it is our job to create new frameworks accordingly. Heretofore, Mary Parrish's persona has endured the same erasure as the event itself, no doubt because of the systematic suppression of the Tulsa story, but also undoubtedly because of her gender and the ease of appropriating the work product of a woman without feeling compelled to center her. It is common for works by unknown or less known people to be folded into the efforts of those who have a bigger platform. There was no mechanism for recognizing and celebrating her, or perhaps there was no will because of the inability to recognize the significance of her contribution. Her name fell into obscurity. Other names emerged and were rightfully, very rightfully celebrated for their work on behalf of Tulsa's legacy. And her work is a testimony to her capacity to speak for herself, yet this independent, well-spoken woman remained in the background. Did people who relied on her work look for her descendants? I don't know. But I do believe that because she was a woman, with a daughter as her only first-degree descendant, the common disruptions that happen in women's lives and take them off their own track, marriage, children, extended family responsibilities, and more, upended the preservation and propagation of her legacy. Beyond these factors, had the capture and dissemination of the story been valued from the outset, Mary Parrish would have, without question, been a more widely known figure. But thankfully, we see things differently today. And there's more to the story of the Little Red Book and of bringing Mary Jones Parrish's name back to prominence. In 2011, my daughter's law school classmate invited us to the home of a prominent Washington, D.C. activist and politico who was hosting a fundraiser for the yet-to-be-built National Museum of African American History and Culture. We gave a founding member contribution and met John Franklin, who spoke on behalf of the new museum. I approached him, aware that his father, the venerable John Hope Franklin, was from Tulsa, and told him that my great-grandmother also survived the massacre and had written events of the Tulsa disaster. He gave me his card. A few years later, when my father passed away and the museum was closer to opening, I considered donating the book to the museum. But a textile preservationist I met pulled my coattails that museum contributions often end up in storage So without any way to ensure that her work would be featured, I held on to the book. I did not wish to participate in the continuing erasure of my own foremother. So when Tom Payton, the director of Trinity University Press, invited me to be part of the new book they were preparing to republish, I accepted the invitation and committed to elevating the life and legacy of Mary Parrish, a woman alone. And this is debatable because some records indicate that she was with her husband in Tulsa, though her own account of her life in 1921 all but explicitly establishes her as a single mother to her daughter. She managed to get this book done. She worked as a teacher at the local branch of the YMCA in Greenwood, teaching the secretarial sciences, and ran her own school teaching those same skills. It was a time when many exceptional women, and certainly Black women, took jobs as secretaries to gain entry into the workforce, help support their families, and they played thereby an increasing role in the economy and society. When women would have been eager to learn these skills, so Mary Parrish would have had strong demand for her business. By her own account, she had never worked for white people, although many Black women worked as domestics in white homes. Of course, this was likely the mechanism by which Black women saw in the white homes of Tulsa Greenwood's looted possessions after the conflagration. The dissonance of coming across your or your neighbor's hard-earned property in the homes of the community that had destroyed your own without punishment or even simple accountability must have been crushing. That is but one example of the rape of Greenwood that informs how we look at the massacre today. But Mary Parrish's life was not solely defined by the thing that the world knows as the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was born in Yazoo City, Mississippi in 1890, and we know that she was living in Boley, Oklahoma in 1914, the year that her daughter, Florence Mary, my grandmother, was born. Mary Jones and Simon Parrish were married in 1912, and by the late teens, the family was living in Rochester, New York, but I would like to discover why they relocated there. It could have been for some perceived opportunity, or it could have been restlessness and a hunt for something different. In 1918, Mary Parrish traveled to Tulsa to visit her brother and was impressed by the community she found here. There was a vitality and a spirit of cooperation that appealed to her. She could envision making a living and was soon to return after that initial visit. She secured a job at the Bunton branch of the YMCA and opened her own school to facilitate women who wanted to learn the secretarial arts. She was teaching the night of the massacre. Mary Parrish's secretarial students had left for the evening, and she and her daughter were passing the time until bedtime. But there would be no rest that night. Little Florence Mary stood in the window amusing herself as her mother read. Gazing out into the night, Florence said, "Mother, look at the cars full of people." But the young mother took no heed, continuing to read her book to relax after dismissing her typewriting students for the evening at about 9 o'clock. She realized the urgency of her daughter's calls when the little girl at last said, "Mother, I see men with guns." She then sprang to the window and saw for herself what her daughter was saying. White men with guns invaded the area, some of whom, according to historian Scott Ellsworth, did drive-by shootings of Black residents who were unfortunate enough to be on the street at the time, and shot into Black people's homes as well. Mary Parrish was reluctant to leave, in a quandary about the safest course of action, but was finally persuaded to flee. With the release of Mary Parrish's book, the public can learn this important history and has a chance to apply the measures of objective reality to what some people have suppressed or denied through the years. We value written history in our society. We like to think of ourselves as objective and rational. This may have influenced the view of oral testimony as being subjective at worst and uncorroborated at best. What great-grandmother Mary's contemporaneous account does for us is to corroborate and underpin the accuracy and veracity of what living witnesses have said all along. This is not lore. It is an epic, historical event recounted with clear-eyed precision in real time. We may well ask ourselves why this is important now. Last week's congressional testimony, given by 107-year-old Viola Fletcher, offers a partial answer to this question. Mother Fletcher recounted that awful night and subsequent day, her calm tone and demeanor belying the horror that she witnessed as a 7-year-old, same age as my grandmother at the time of the tragedy. She asked for justice from her country and for full acknowledgement of the atrocity. She described the hardship that she endured in the ensuing years and throughout her life, a course that she feels would not have been her lot had it not been for the massacre. She asked for reparations. Mother Fletcher told the truth, and it was captured in the congressional record for all of history. Her oral presentation was heard by the country, and her voice was silenced no more. She spoke up and spoke out in her own voice and made her case at the table of power. Everything she described seeing aligns with what Mary Parrish's book reports as fact. No one can turn a blind eye to Mother Fletcher's plight as she seeks to live in dignity and security, and no one can hide behind arguing the technicalities of providing personal redress to this long-lived survivor. The restoration that is required for her healing should be a natural sequelae of truth. Mother Fletcher advocated for herself and told the truth with her own voice. Mary Parrish recorded the truth with her notebook and typewriter. The truth is there for all to behold, and we know with certainty that capturing and preserving the truth are central to ensuring restorative justice. But the enemies of true justice are working overtime to mute or distort the truth. From the halls of Congress to state legislatures, down to school districts and classrooms, they are passing legislation and codifying practice to make a sanitized version of American history, all that is available to generations of learners. They are shaping policy that will make it harder to know the complex truth that as full citizens, we are all obligated to grapple with. But truth is not optional in a functioning democracy. It is a fundamental element. The nation must awake to the dangers of remaining passive in the face of the onslaught against truth, and we have to work diligently to keep truth at the forefront of our debates about the solutions we need to find for some of our country's long-standing ills. The nation must awake to the threat of violence from domestic terrorists who have demonstrated that they are willing to use violence to further their regressive agenda. Finally, we must awake to the complicity of our own silence and passivity in the face of threats to others who may not look like us. History will judge our time much as we look back and dissect and analyze the Tulsa of 1921. I certainly hope that we will be able to withstand the scrutiny. Thank you.
2, 3. There we go. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was inspiring. Thank you for your remarks. We have just a few more minutes, and I would like to ask a few questions of you. When I think about the title of this book, it's so powerful. The nation must awake. Tell me more about that. So if you were to evaluate the United States and our state between consciousness and somberness, where are we? Have we awakened to the realities of racism, racial injustices, anti-Blackness?
I think that we have made significant progress. I was speaking with a group a couple of weeks ago, and someone asked me, are we any better than we were? Certainly we're better than we were. More people are aware, more people are committed, but at the same time, there's still opportunity and space for progress. I think the fundamental thing that we need to recall is that opposing ideas can exist within the same space. I say opposing ideas, not opposing facts, but opposing ideas can exist within the same space, even within the mind of an individual. And one of our charges as human beings is to reconcile those and find a way, even if they're not reconcilable, to go forward, even in the face of that tension between what is and what we hope will be, what was, and all of those kind of like mixing together is what makes us dynamic as human beings. It pushes us forward. It stresses us in a good way. So, the tension itself is not bad. We simply have to be moral, we have to be mature, and we have to be able to recognize unflattering things about ourselves as individuals, as a collective, as a society, as a nation. So, that's part of growing up. And I think that in our country, we're going through a maturation process.
Yeah. In your afterword, you write that in the current era of historic firsts by African Americans, we must recall that the firsts are not overdue because Black people weren't ready. It is the country that wasn't ready. Can you talk more about that?
I certainly would like to. What I think is that while we rightfully celebrate many of these firsts, for example, the first African American Vice President of the United States, it is worthy of celebration. But at the same time, I would hope that people understand that we need to move to the next step where we see that as a normal thing. We see that as normative rather than as some kind of wildly unexpected word in a way that puts us in a place where some of the things that we almost overly celebrate because they're so new and so different, these should be expected things certainly by now in terms of where the African American community is and the things that have been accomplished years ago that simply are not, in the public consciousness. And I think that that's why the framing of this book is so important. We're able to see how not just financially successful these people were, they were sophisticated people. And that's what we need to be able to recognize in others in order to appreciate their and our own humanity.
Thank you for that. As you spoke, you talk about the role that post-traumatic disorders and historic traumas have. And you also write in the afterword about trauma that survivors face, and you powerfully describe something about a descendant of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. You say, the hardship that generations of his family carried from the trauma of being hated by their own government and fellow citizens remains a burden. Tell us more about that, please.
Well, I think that it's important to use language in a certain way, especially when you're appealing to someone's humanity and compassion. And I think that you have to really create a language that is accessible for people and that they can really understand the humanity that you're expressing. For example, when you express anger or something like that, it can be very off-putting. But if you are able to frame that within the context of what someone is experiencing, which is typically pain, and and the symptom you see is anger. If we can separate those things and really understand from a deeply human perspective what people are experiencing so that we can have compassion for how they're expressing it, and then move past that to understand the basis of the pain and the trauma of abuse and the reaction and the feeling that I'm not getting what I want, but I feel hated. Something that's a bit more accessible for people on an emotional level. And sometimes it's just a quick switch of a word, and you're able to connect with people in that. Well, I'll tell you, I had a strained relationship with my father, as a matter of fact. My parents were divorced when I was very young. And my grandmother, Florence Mary, she was from a divorced household. So these things tend to continue to carry through. Um, the reason that this is such a powerful experience for me is because even though I was 34, I didn't have the kind of relationship with my father. We talked, but we just didn't spend a lot of time together. And there are things that normally come up in the course of spending hours and days and weeks and months and years with a person. I didn't have that with my father. I left California when I was 18, and spent most of my rest of my life, of his life. So at some point, I was only seeing him once a year. And I deeply regret that, I didn't perceive at that time that he was probably repressing. He had some impetus to repress, conversations about this, conversations about his own mother. Oh, this is coming in and out. It is better. My own father developed alcoholism as well. Coping mechanisms. I mean, we know today that these are ways that people self-medicate when they're in pain. And so she had a painful life. He had the experience of living with someone who was deeply wounded and in pain. And these things, this is how it transmitted. When people say it transmits through generations, they don't mean genetically. It's in practice, it transmits through. I think that certainly, I see those symptoms, as Dr. Herman talks about, within my own family. And for me, it is painful that we didn't have a close enough relationship, or the
That's a shame about the microphone, so I apologize about that. So
Is this working?
yeah,
This is better,
I
yeah.
think so, yeah. So our time has get this mic. Okay, there we go. So I'm sitting over here because our time has come to an end. And so in closing, I want to just say this. So your great-grandmother wrote that she hoped her book would open the eyes of the thinking people to the impending danger of letting such conditions exist in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I just want to say that you are your great-grandmother's hope alive today.
Thank you so much, Moises. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your encouraging words. I'm just grateful to be here. Thank you all so much for coming to hear my little talk and to hear about my little red book.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you so much. And folks, we will be back at 6 p.m. for the next part of the symposium. Thank you again.